Okay, so we're going to start the next ORTC community group meeting, and so this is our fourth meeting, and you can jump to the next slide. Just a reminder of the IPR policy, which basically is that we can't take feedback from people until people join the community group and agree to the IPR policies as illustrated by the W3C, so that we don't run into any IPR issues when using any proposals later on. So just go ahead and look at the link if you have any questions. Next. Again, this is our fourth community group meeting, and we hope to bring everybody up to the status on the ORTC specification as it is, make some progress on outstanding issues, talk about the WebRTC 1.0 dependencies that exist and our plan to deal with that. There's a few proposals for some last changes that we believe we need regarding a bunch of different little things, and we need to organize and plan for implementation feedback at this time. So next. Again, the link is in the slide for the Hangouts URL if people want to join, or this will be recorded and published later anyway. We do need a scribe. Can someone volunteer to scribe at this time? Do we have the, what's the link, Eric, again, for the IRC room?
Just 1 second here, I'll pull it up.
I've never scribed it before, but I think I can give it a shot.
If you, that would be greatly appreciated.
Might do a terrible job, so.
Well, no worse than anybody else.
Is there a particular doc? Does there exist a doc already that I should fill in? Or should
No, we do it in IRC. You just keep typing sentence after sentence in IRC, your chat window.
Oh.
So well, you can, you know what? You can create a doc if you really want. It doesn't really.
I've just published the IRC room, which I usually run in a browser, and the channel is ORTC.
And I'm going to connect in there as well.
So
we might spend more time debugging this than this person.
Yeah.
Right.
If it's not working right away, then just take notes, whatever mechanism you want, and we'll publish them.
Okay. I mean, I tried it, so permission denied, so I've never done
that. Just give it a sec; it'll join anyway.
Oh.
Yeah.
All right.
Exactly. All right. So I think if you're ready, Peter, we can move on, and you can start scribing however you want.
Yeah, I'll start a doc while I'm waiting for this thing to not be permission denied.
Okay.
All right, ready.
All right. So next slide. We've gone over these links in the past, but again, we have the community group website on the W3C org website. We have the public mailing list where anybody can publish, and then we have the contributors list, which only people who are part of the community group can publish their contributions to the specification. And you should just join the community group anyway. And okay, next slide. Developers as well as the API website is all going to be in ortc.org, so you can just go there and find links to everything else, and the GitHub issues where we maintain all the changes that need to be done to the specification are listed in that link, and you can look at it to see the status of any outstanding issues that we have in the spec. Next slide. Bernard, I'm going to let you take over for this little bit.
Okay, so a bunch of things that were reflected in this editor's draft, and we'll talk about them individually. One is the non-multiplexed RTP, RTCP, and ice freezing. I will talk a little bit about that, and then there's a removal of the filter parameters and create parameters functions. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then some of the things which came out of that with respect to changes in capabilities. We'll also talk a little bit about read-only attributes and the ICE restart method. Next slide. Okay, so we had a bunch of attributes which weren't read-only, and so we have replaced those with read-only attributes and setters. Among those are set transport methods, which are now in RTC DTLS transport. We also have set transport in the RTC RTP sender, which is both for the RTP transport and potentially an optional RTCP transport, as well as in the RTC RTP receiver. And on top of that, we now have a set track method within RTC RTP sender. So basically, we shouldn't have, I think in the spec at this point, we don't have any non-read-only attributes, I hope. And everything should be set this way.
And the logic was that behind that was because of exceptions that can happen, correct? Or was there another reason too?
That was certainly one reason, was because of exceptions. But also, yeah.
Can you explain the exception rationale?
Well, if you're just writing stuff and writing something weird, then into a non-read-only attribute. If it was a function, you'd get an exception immediately, presumably. But wouldn't it be an issue if you were just writing something into a non-read-only attribute?
I was under the impression. I agree. This kind of makes it more obvious, but I would think that you could, since exceptions are, method calls, underneath, you could also throw an exception if you try to assign something that wasn't supposed to be assigned.
Yeah.
I do know that it's an issue with regard to dictionaries, because when you set a read-only attribute and it's a dictionary,
right,
it doesn't actually set the properties within it as read-only. But I'm not sure when it comes to like interfaces when that isn't truly necessary. I think Justin is right, I believe, regarding setting attributes, being able to throw an exception as well.
Yeah.
The dictionaries are just a property bag, so there's no checking that goes on when you do any setting.
One comment here: if the attribute, the transfer attribute is not read-only, and you're setting the new value to it, it might take more than a few milliseconds for the user agent to recognize whether it's wrong or right, and that will block the US thread. So that's why having a set method is better than having a kind of a writable attribute here.
Yeah, the other thing is atomicity. If you're changing something within a dictionary, right, like one entry at a time or something, you could get into weird states.
Yeah, but there were also discussions earlier whether we wanted to have this set transport method everywhere or not. And Peter, you were on that email thread as well. You want to comment here as well?
So, well, I think before we discuss whether to have the set transport or not, we should finish the discussion of whether we like the model of set X and then read only X, as opposed to writable X attribute.
That's true.
So I think one nice thing about having a read-only attribute X and then a set X is that you can add later extra parameters to the setter without causing trouble. And if you want to be able to change multiple things at once, you can do so atomically. So for example, in this case, where you want to set, if we do have a set transport where you set both the RTP and RTCP transports at the same time, you'd like to pass those both into a setter, have them changed at the same time, rather than setting two attributes that are writable.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, agree.
I personally like the model where attributes are read-only and then there are setters. I think it gives us more flexibility and control over how things are actually set.
Right, and also in case if something, the new parameter, if it's wrong, and then the user agent doesn't have to change the current attribute to keep something working there, at least. It'd be more robust.
Yeah.
I agree with the the rationale. I just want to make sure that we're doing it for those reasons as opposed to like the exception reasons, because I think that if we wanted that to work, we could make that work. the real question I have is that, when would one even use like the set transport method? I feel like if there's not a clear use case for some of these things, we ought to leave them out until there is, so we can avoid any sort of foot gun type things.
Yeah, I remember that we discussed a long time ago to allow DTLS transport to have a .set transport, and we decided back then that we couldn't think of a strong reason to add it, so we should just leave it out. So I'm kind of curious what the strong reason is now.
Well, actually, I think Peter's right, because as I recall, everything was read-only without a setter originally. I think you're correct, Peter.
Right. We discussed at some length whether we would allow the DTLS transport to set the ICE transport inside of it to sort of swap it out, because it sounded kind of cool, but we really couldn't come up with a good reason to do that, so we left it out, because why add complexity when we don't need it? But now it's there. So is that just kind of an oversight? We forgot? I think we should just leave it out again if we can't think of a strong reason.
I think it was an oversight because it wasn't read-only attribute before, so we added the setter in. And there was a reason. And before ICE restart, we didn't have a mechanism to reuse the same keying material. But now that we have an ICE restart, we don't need to worry about that. So
yeah.
Okay, so they can be, set transport can be removed? Is that the consensus?
From DTLS transport, certainly.
Yeah. How about the other ones?
So we need to think about how bundle works in this case. And, it starts out on one transport and then it moves over to another transport. How is that actually going to work? And I think that actually ends up being a bit more complicated than just kind of saying, like, sender.transport now equals like other X, because like there are some cases where you need to be able to receive data even before, like on either the new or the old transport, even before you get the signaling. So we probably have to go figure that out separately. My real question on this was on the set transport. Do we need to specify the transport and RtCP transport, given that we have this coupling of the transports inside the actual, associated transport mechanism that we've introduced?
Unfortunately, I believe.
I tried to put a comment in the slides of all the different options available to skin this cat. Which slide is it on? Yeah. Okay. So one of them is set transport or set RtCP transport. Another one is to put it in constructor. Another one is to have the RTP sender and receiver know nothing about RtCP mux or not, and just have the DTLS transport have create associated transport similar to the ICE one. And another one is just to require the JavaScript to create a DTLS transport that wraps the associated ICE transport and then have it sort of work magically. Because really, the RtP sender and receiver don't necessarily need to know that RtCP mux or not is going on. It's really just a matter of the JavaScript at some point needs to create a DTLS transport and say, this is the DTLS transport for this RtCP ICE transport.
Yeah.
So we have several different ways we can skin the cat.
That is the correct issue. There's also another issue regarding keeping the object alive. If you don't have it owned by something, the object will die. So if you create a DTLS transport and don't attach it to something somewhere, then you're going to require the developer to keep it around for the sake of having an object life cycle. So it has to be attached to something.
Yeah, the other issue was if you wanted to collect stats on the transport, actually having it exist would make that a lot easier, rather than being hidden under the covers.
Well, the DTLS transport does need to exist.
Yeah.
It's just a question of what does the once it's created, what does the JavaScript developer do with it? And I guess
the answer is not a lot, right? All it really does is get put into the sender and receiver as an optional argument part.
Well, no, I mean even that's in question, right? They don't necessarily have to do that.
Yeah, it could know, right, without the argument.
Right. So
a question I have here is really look at the timing here. Consider we have a peer-to-peer connection. On one side of an RTP sender, and we call set transport with a new transport inside. And that's, on the other side, there's a receiver, right? RTC receiver. So when we set the new transfer on the sender here, what happens really on the wire before the other receiver also set new transfers?
Well, I would assume you set this before you call send, right? I hope.
And that's anyway, the API, this part is not really super clear to me, and then we need to think through more.
Yeah, I think thinking the bundle case would be a good way to maybe figure this out.
Yeah, if we just say we configure, we construct RTP sender receiver using a predetermined transport, that's easier to manage. And but if we change anything on the fly, it's always kind of time difference between the two sides. And what happens between, and then that's a kind of difficult problem.
So I think Bernard's suggestion is apt, that we walk through how the bundle case should work, and once we understand that, we'll know what we need to do with the method.
Okay.
Okay, right.
So let's continue. Let's take that on the list then, and continue on and work through that problem. And
well, that's file an issue. I think that tracking things in issues is actually a good way to deal with these sort of things. So add that to the tracker.
okay, so make a note, Peter, if you don't mind, that we're going to add an issue on that.
I just added that. Does it too?
Okay.
Just a quick comment before we move on. If we remove the set transport for the DTLS transport, that means on the constructor, the ICE transport will be required. It won't be optional. I think we're okay with that, right? Okay, right.
Yes,
cool.
that is the impact of that.
Yes, right.
Okay, next.
Next slide.
Yeah, so I think we've already talked basically through this, the implication of non-muxing as you create transport for RTCP, and potentially they end up as optional in the sender and the receiver constructors. Next. Okay, for ice freezing, we have the RTC ice transport controller. I have had some questions about this from various folks, and I would like to emphasize that if you're not multiplexing AVP as well as RTCP, you need this. Because without it, the ice freezing might not happen consistently between the endpoints. So no, I think this is a required function. It's not optional even if you do RTP mux. Would you agree, Peter?
Yeah, ice freezing is necessary even for the mux case.
Yeah, so this isn't, even if you're doing RTCP, you still need this if you're not muxing A and B. So I did get also, I think there was a question from Shijin about whether you could just push the stuff, automatically push it onto the end without the index. Shijin, do you have any other commentary on?
I had a comment that this just allows the JavaScript developer a little more flexibility. They don't have to make sure they call add transport in the right order. And it doesn't cause any significant implementation pain. So it's optional, so if you want to add it to the end, just don't include it.
Right, and I think it says that, right? That if you don't, if it's actually, yeah, if you don't, well, it doesn't say optional, does it?
Yeah, one question here, we don't know what's the internal kind of state. Imagine we have a list. Let me mute and is that better? All right. So if we have a list of transports here, and the application doesn't know what's the current state of the connection, through the list, we're trying one by one, right? And adding something to the middle of the list is not well-defined behavior to me.
So it's not that you're adding something to the middle of the list at any random time.
Yeah.
It's that if you're going through a list of RTP senders and you want to add them in a specific order, you could add them to you could go in any order to set up, what their actual hierarchy is relative to the ice freezing rules. Typically, you won't need to do anything, and you can just pass null as the, second argument, and it'll just add it to the end.
So in a way, if oops.
Justin, you have to mute when you're talking.
Are you getting a lot of fan noise or something, or?
No, you have echo from you.
Yeah, okay, go on.
Next. Let's say if we complete the list already, we're adding a new transport to the middle of the list. And basically, the user agent should go back to pick up the new item, right, from the list. Is that the right definition? I just want to make sure if we have the index parameter here, the spec should be clearly defined.
Yeah, if the index parameter is absent, then it should be clearly added to the end of the list. The case where you need to specify the index parameter is, the cases where you might have 3 M sections, and like the first one and the last one are being used, but the middle one's inactive, and then later on you decide to make the middle one active, and now you need to add, in at the middle of the list instead of the end.
Right.
All right, that's not
An echo issue.
Okay. Yeah, and we need to say that the index is optional because right now we don't.
Yeah, it should remove the equals null and put optional instead.
Yeah.
From an implementation perspective, we're going to have to support all the scenarios, and the spec should be clear on that as well. That's the ask.
Yeah, fair enough. I would just make a generalized comment regarding list management. Really what it is, it's a list management function. It would be better in principle to allow lists to be managed outside of more primitive methods like this. That's just my general feedback. JavaScript has very nice mechanisms for maintaining lists. We don't necessarily need to do it ourselves. Might even be better just to have a set transports and provide the whole list at once, but I don't really care.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we want to allow the entire list to be frogged at any time.
Yeah, especially since that would allow removals.
Yeah, that would be could be weird.
So you're not allowed to remove it all?
Well, not currently.
You remove via stop. When the transport stops, it's implicitly removed.
Okay, it's not a big deal. Just a general comment.
Yep.
You don't need to hold anything up because of that.
Okay. Next. Okay, so we removed create and filter parameters, and then the question came up, well, how do you rewrite the examples 7 and 8? And so we hypothesized two functions, mycaps to send params and mycaps to receive params, that are not currently written in section 15.2, but they kind of sit there. And so in thinking about these, it became clear that we needed, the way we went ahead and tried to do it in the examples was to exchange audio, video, send, and receive capabilities, and then have these functions derive the parameters from those exchanged things. So one of the implications of that was you needed the capabilities with enough details to actually create the parameters. And also without any implicit knowledge of the codecs and headers and extensions and all of these properties, you should just be able to take that stuff as sent and create a reasonable set of parameters. We're not assuming that you'd be able to do this for the most complicated case with like simulcast and layering, but if it's just one single audio and video stream, you should be able to do that without any specialized knowledge of specific codecs. Next. So here's the hypothesis of what that function, which it's not built in or anything, but what that method, if written out, should actually do. You determine the codecs that the sender and the receiver have in common, so the intersection of the codecs. And then within each common codec, determine the intersection of the supported parameters, header extensions, and RtcP feedback mechanisms, and then configure them. And then for each common codec, determine the payload type to be used. For example, you could take the receiver's preferred payload type and just stick that in. And then you'll assume that the RTC, RTCP parameters have their default values. Like, for example, that would be RtpRtCP mux is true, for example. And then from all that, you should have built up RTC, RTP parameters enabling the jointly supported features and codecs. Anyway, that's basically the theory of how this function should be written. And hopefully we'll actually have it and provide a link to it, for example, in the spec, so actually prove it really does work. Next. And so when we attempted to go through that exercise, we discovered some deficiencies. One is that it wasn't clear how to choose the payload number consistently. Originally, we didn't even have a preferred payload type in the capabilities, so we added that. The feedback capabilities as they were global. For example, we gave the global header extensions that were supported and then the global RTCP feedback messages, but then the question was for any particular codec, which feedback messages were supported and which header extensions made sense. And it wasn't possible to derive that from the capabilities as they previously were. And same for the header extensions. There was also, it turns out, there was a bunch of RTCP things that we decided we needed to do, needed to be able to express, such as RTCP, well, a couple of things. We had a discussion about capabilities and whether things that were mandatory to implement in the RTP usage draft actually needed to be capabilities or not. In general, we decided they didn't need to be capabilities because you could always assume that since they were mandatory to implement that they were there, but they did need to be settings. Because you could, for example, not do RTP, RTCP mux, even though it's mandatory to implement. And then another issue came up, what if you had multiple clock rates? How would you express that? And so we decided that the encoding parameters would point to the codec by payload ID and not by name, as they had previously, so that you could have codecs with the same name but different usages, so different payload types, if that makes sense. So basically, in going through that exercise of trying to code that function, we ended up with a fair number of changes to the capabilities on RTP, RTCP, RTC, RTP parameters. Next. So here's what they look like all cleaned up. I'm not going to try to go through all of this, but basically you have a separate capabilities dictionary for RTC, RTP capabilities. Well, I should also mention on codec capabilities, these are nicely separated out now. And then on the others, you also have your header extensions and your feedback. The way feedback is organized, it's basically according to the way the specification actually works with a type and then parameters associated with type. And there are multiple types. There are transport layer RTCP feedback messages, which apply to all codecs. And there are payload-specific ones that apply to certain codecs. Oh, and also the header extensions now have a kind field, so that when you get them in the capabilities, you know, hey, this is a header extension that applies to audio, like client to mixer or mixer to client, or it's something that applies to video, and that will also help you figure out whether to put it into parameters or not for a given codec. Next.
So just real quick, so the multi-stream support, like what's that all about? Everything else kind of makes sense to me.
Which one? The multi-stream support thing?
Yeah, then
okay. Yeah, we're gonna have a we'll have a discussion of that in a couple of slides. Peter said, "Hey, this doesn't make sense," and so it actually needs a bit of a longer discussion. But good point.
Yeah, I also think that the layer numbers are also something we probably need to talk about because it's not clear that these are independent quantities.
Yeah, so we have a little discussion on the issues that revolve around this. We'll get to it in a minute. But anyway, good catch. Next. Okay, so this is the equivalent for parameters. And so we've kept the capabilities and the parameters quite separate. And I don't know that there's a lot to say here necessarily, except that I think it is a useful exercise to actually write those JavaScript functions and actually demonstrate that it really works and actually generate something, because as we went through this, there were a lot of tricky things that we had to deal with. So it's not as simple as maybe we had thought. So I think that's all about That's about all I want to say about it for this moment, but why don't we go to the next slide? Yeah.
Is it worth talking about the header extension URIs right here inside of coder parameters? Justin pointed out to me at one point that on the sender side, we don't necessarily need that because whenever the sender modifies which codec is the first codec in the RTP parameters, it can also modify what header extensions are included in the RTP parameters. Because the intention there is to allow per codec control of what header extensions are sent. But if you're controlling which codec is used at any given time by making it the first codec in the RTP parameters list, then you could just, at the same time when you change that, also change the header extensions that are sent.
Yeah.
That's true, but for the sake of consistency with the receiver, it's a little bit nicer not to, because the receiver doesn't have that luxury.
But why would the receiver have per codec header extension URIs? That doesn't, like, why does this make sense for a receiver? You just say, here are the header extensions I receive.
Yeah, you're right.
Fair enough.
It just knows the IDs, it can deal with them, right? That's all it needs to know. Oops.
Okay, we'll give it a try with that model and see if we run into any problems.
No, but I think there's a behavior issue here, which is like, what if you leave it out? What does that imply, right? On the receiver. I mean, are you saying don't listen to this? That kind of makes no sense. I think there may be an issue to file here to clear up some of the expected behavior.
Yeah, let's file an issue on this and try and work through it and see if we run into any more problems. So
yeah, can someone note that in the yeah, and I think it's actually all of this is something to think about for the discussion we're going to have in a few minutes when we start talking about things that can change in all of these parameters, right? Things that can be said and what happens when things change. It's probably more dynamic behavior than one might think. Anyway.
Yeah, I think just that we were getting to a place where the receiver parameters will not necessarily be symmetric with the. It may not be symmetric with the sender parameters. That I guess we have the sender parameters of the full set of things that we offer that we can send, but what we actually end up sending is just going to be, I think, encapsulated in the encoding parameters, and right. Probably where we should indicate, what header extensions and such that do we actually want to use.
Yes. Yeah, but what I'm thinking here, and I think we have to discuss a little bit more, is, right, part of the reason we had a concern about what these things were set to at any given moment was if you wanted to signal them, like tell the other side what SSRCs are being used. And we'll get into this discussion of how you know when the stuff is stable. And if stuff starts changing, then there's a question about what, how do you know that it changed? Do you have to, do you have to have an event? We'll get into that in a minute. But I think we just have to understand very clearly what is static and what isn't, and what happens when it starts to change.
Well, in principle, I think we're close to where we need to be, but I think we're going to need to, refine a few little things here, and yeah, as we discussed. And so let's open up some remaining issues on that and get those cleaned up. I don't think they're major blockers. They're just, yeah,
we've come a long way, certainly.
Yeah, it's a lot better than it used to be.
Yeah. Okay, next.
So basically, we're asking at this time, given where we're going, does everybody feel we're on the right direction? And if you have any questions at this time, aside from the stuff that we're going to get to regarding that thing that Justin mentioned, that you want to bring up before we continue. So this is old business. Anything we want to discuss before we get into the new business?
I mean, my only concern is I feel like the spatial stuff and quality stuff is still kind of underdefined. But we've talked about that a little bit before. and maybe that just we need examples of exactly how this stuff is supposed to work in terms of the temporal scale parameters and quality scale and those sorts of things.
Yeah, in the examples we don't have a lot on that. We have, I think the most complicated one we have is spatial simulcast with temporal scaling. And that's as complicated as it gets.
I agree with you, and even the samples, it's not clear to me how do you define, is it 1.0, is it 0.5, is it 0.25, like what is the ordering, what is the dependency? None of that is clear to me at all, and we need to have clear understanding of what that is.
Yeah, I even got a question from somebody at the WebRTC conference asking me how the quality scalability was going to work, because he said, hey, in your congestion control algorithms you're changing quality. And what does that imply from the way quality scalability would work? Is the base level quality changing in the congestion control, or is it, how exactly is that all happening? And I didn't know what to say.
So we should file an issue on that to clearly define the meaning, definition, behavior, expectations, ordering, all the rest of it, so that we have a clear understanding of exactly what we need to do.
My general feeling is that the quality stuff seems to be the least understood of any of the scalability things.
Yes, I agree.
And my feeling at the moment right now is that we ought to maybe just remove the quality stuff until we feel like we can come up with a fully baked proposal on that.
Yeah, I haven't had any implementation experience with it, so I certainly can't really help figure out what it does.
Is there anybody who has an objection to removing it? Because I'm certainly in favor of it. And the idea is removing it temporarily until we have a proposal.
Yeah, unless we have somebody who's planning to use this, it's probably a good idea to take it out.
Well, consider it turfed, and if someone wants to come back, then they can write the proposal on exactly what it does, and then we can easily add it back.
Okay, sorry, I'm taking notes here. What are we deciding to table? Or
quality scalability. So we're going to leave in spatial and temporal, but we're going to remove quality.
Just on the max for layers, or also the min quality?
Everything to do with quality SVC.
No, I don't. SVC, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and quality simulcast, that is, well, no, you can't really touch that, or you touch quality overall. So just quality SVC.
Yeah, quality SVC.
Quality scale, and then the number of quality layers in the caps. I think those are the two things to remove.
I think so, but I'd have to double check. Okay, so let's mark that as an item. We'll get it done.
So the only other thing then is that we need to define exactly what frame rate scale does. Like, how do you actually configure temporal scalability? Because I think we've had some examples for configuring spatial, but we need to figure out how the temporal stuff works. So I think that's the point where we definitely know we want that. Let's just make an issue, and we can come back to it.
Agreed.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to take notes.
I'm taking some notes in the IRC channel.
Oh, did you get in that thing? All right. So I was writing them in a doc because the IRC thing wasn't working for me.
Okay,
but
so we have to define temporal as well as we have spatial, and I don't even think we have spatial fully 100% defined either in terms of how to lay out the structure and the encoding parameters. So it's got to be absolutely 100% clear how to do it, so that we all have a consistent implementation.
Right. Yes.
Right. Or even just an example saying, here is a single layer stream with temporal scalability turned on. Like, how does one do that? And then we should have a more complex example with multi-layer spatial and temporal turn on.
So right now what we have, the last example in example 11, and this is all we have, is combined spatial simulcast with two-layer temporal.
Oh, well, that should be a good enough start.
Well, it might not be totally obvious because it's, anyway, certainly more discussion of that is probably not a bad thing.
So I forget what there's something in RTP parameters right now for turning on temporal.
Yes, it is the frame rate scale that Justin just mentioned.
I thought that just sets like the maximum, or it just controls frame rate. It doesn't actually control if you have temporal scalability, right?
Well, no, it would, because if, say, you had two temporal layers, what you'll do typically is you'll set the frame rate scale to 0.5 for the first one and then 1 for the second one.
Oh, right. Okay, I get it.
So that's kind of the example that's there. If it's not clear, we can have a better one.
Right. Well, I think the key thing, though, is that is the expectation that we actually have, if you have 3 spatial layers and 3 temporal layers, you have to create 9 RTP encoding objects with the appropriate dependency graph.
Yes. Yeah, that could certainly that could be put in an appendix. That could be a little section by itself. It's not exactly the most simple thing. But yeah, that might not be a bad thing.
Well, I think the key question we need to ask ourselves is, do we really see a case, do we really want to support transmitting different temporal layers and different SSRCs?
That's the question we're about to tee up in a minute.
Okay, well then I'll hold my comments until then.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so okay, we're at coming attractions now. Go ahead.
Okay, so aside from the stuff, unless there's nothing else that we have to cover old business, and we've got a list of issues that we have to resolve through, which will be, again, coming attractions, we have to define the exact behavior of the RTP listener and receiver objects and how the latching rules work. We have some proposals on DTMF and stats on IDP coming up. And if WebRTC 1.0 has new updates that get done or proposed, we will then incorporate a synchronization process to our ORTC spec to incorporate that functionality as it makes sense for ORTC.
Also, data channel has to be added to this list too, I think.
Ah, yes, I missed data channel. My mistake. Okay. So next slide. So just a note, data channel. Okay. Issues for discussion today. We're going to go through the WebRTC 1.0 dependencies. We're going to talk briefly on ICE restart, CNAME, the RTP parameter defaulting, and MST, SST, SS, and MS. And that's what Justin was just mentioning a few minutes ago. So let's get through hopefully the non-controversial stuff first. Okay, so WebRTC dependencies. We have a dependency for IDP, stats, data channel, and DTMF. So the idea is that as much as possible, we're going to take the 1.0 API definitions, incorporate them as is an ORTC, and as close as possible. Some things have to change because our objects are a little bit slightly different, or we clean up a few things that don't quite make sense for us. So, but otherwise, we try and keep it one-for-one parity as much as possible. So, next. So, Martin was working on the IDP, and this is what he said we should be doing for IDP for us. We should just add this to the DTLS transport where you can, well, the API is clear. I mean, I don't quite honestly understand how it works. I have to review it myself, but this is what he said we should be doing.
So my question is, maybe we need Martin here to answer this, is the expectation we need to do this for each DTLS transport in a non-muxing case?
Yeah, that was my question.
As was mine, and I could even see it being possible that they're not one and the same. So
yeah, it kind of makes me nervous because I can't see how you. Well, it's obviously weird, right? If you do it twice for the RTCP and the RTP, is everything the same or not? Or
Right. So, if we want to do it, make sure we only do it one time, we could stuff this on the transport controller object. But I think what we should probably do is file an issue on this and then go assign it to Martin and then figure out where we go from there.
Yeah.
It's not just an ORTC issue. So yes.
Well, WebRTC 1.0 sort of said that there's one identity for the call, for the peer connection. You can't have it different per stream or transport. And so, not only is there more work to do if you have to do this for each transport, but you could even end up with an inconsistent state where you could end up with different identity assertions for different DTLS things, which might be bad.
Okay, so let's file an issue for Martin because I honestly don't know this in depth enough to be able to answer it myself, and I'm not sure anybody else does either.
Yeah, just a question: is this an ORTC issue or a WebRTC 1.0 issue or an IATF issue?
I think this is an ORTC because it only exists when we have the independent access to the transport objects.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so let's make note on that and move on because I don't think we're going to get an answer today. No. So stats. So this is actually, Martin proposed this as well as a cleanup, and I agree with Peter's comment saying the stats base is not the best thing, but we already have an RTC stats object, so that exists, so we couldn't call it that. Call it
RTC stats provider.
Yeah, that would be better.
Be better.
But the idea here is that you call you have an interface, get stats, and it returns a promise where your stats, when they're ready, are delivered to you in your promise. And you just derive all your various interfaces from this provider interface, and therefore you know which ones do and do not provide stats. That's how it works.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, and it's a promise now, which I think makes it cleaner. Oh, actually, there is a question I think you had, Peter, which is a good one, which is we're somewhat inconsistent with the use of promises now. Right? Some things are like send in RTC's sender is not a promise, but the data channel send is a promise. This thing is going to be a promise. Is it desirable to have some consistency?
Yeah, I think we should, if we're going to go down the route of promises, have them all be promises and not just some of them. Or vice versa. If we're not going to use promises, then don't use them there.
Well, I think in case with a clear stats, or make a method call and pass in a success callback and a failure callback, we should be migrating this stuff to promises as much as possible. Some of the other ones aren't as clear cut, and I don't want to go overboard with promises. I think we should do the ones that make sense just because this is 1.1 API with a chance to do some polishing. But I'm not as sort of bought into the whole promises are a panacea thing. So
yeah,
we've enough good stuff in ORTC that this stands on its own. So that's the only where it's really obvious.
Yeah. I agree with that statement. And promises work well when there's only a success or failback, but they don't necessarily work when you have multiple events. So you have to be careful when to use them.
Exactly.
So when we're going to get into a discussion of an area where it's definitely not a panacea, and we have to be really clear what we think the promise is there for. But we'll get into that in a minute.
Okay. So aside from that, is there any issues on stats? If not, we'll move on to the data channel.
Oh, can someone just clarify for the stats, are we going to use the base style as extension to all the objects or only as independent objects?
Only the ones that have stats.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not even a base, right? It's like these are all mix-ins. So like you just call RTC stats provider, and that can make a partial, or that can be an interface that can be inherited by any of these things.
Yeah.
All right, so that's basically in line with the solution being proposed, not the current one.
Not the current one, right?
Okay, right. So that will limit the future extension in a way, right? Because every time we want to add something here, and then we're gonna have to update all the objects.
That That was the original reason we went with the current thing, right? Just
Yeah, right.
on the
Because we
object.
don't really know what kind of stats we're getting yet, and the stats object interface might have more things and that can be easily extended if it's a more independent object.
Yeah, but stats, it returns when the promise returns an interface which has a very flexible API as it is anyway. So it's just basically saying gather up the stats related to this interface, and then you have a much more detailed interface to get detailed stats where you actually, manipulate what you're talking about. So I think this actually does work.
This seems reasonable to me.
Okay, right.
Okay. All right, next is data channel. Basically, it's exactly the same as 1.0, except the send returns a promise because it wasn't possible to know when the data is actually delivered. And I think this was Peter's proposal to do it as a promise, but correct me if I'm wrong, Peter.
Yeah, so here's where I feel like we're overstepping our mandate.
I don't think that was my idea. I was surprised by it, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we don't know who thought this up, do we?
'Cause I actually have a lot of questions about what that would mean.
The issue is that if you want to create where you're sending a whole bunch of data. Am I back?
We're back.
Did everybody die, or is it just me?
Everyone, I died.
Yeah, I think the server exploded.
Just give me a sec. I'll share my screen here.
Yeah, just to
Everybody
comment on that
dropped it,
10
just
thing in
me.
the channel.
No, everybody did.
Everybody did. Just to comment on that send thing in the data channel. Now, there's a separate issue, which is that I think there is a bug filed against that in WebRTC 1.0, but that by itself is not a reason to turn this into a promise.
There's a bunch of stuff here, but the main reason we're in this situation is because we inherited the WebSocket API. And the WebSocket API doesn't provide this sort of detail. But the even bigger thing that's missing is the ability to send streams.
Right.
And so I feel like we're signing up for too much by trying to do anything here. I would just keep the API as is, and that if WebSocket gets refactored in the future, we can glom onto that in like a 1.2 or whatever.
Right.
But here's where I think we're pushing ahead too far.
Yeah, because it might not be worth the investment.
Okay, remove promise then.
Okay, let's note that.
I can't see anybody's video anymore. I don't know if it's just me having that problem. I can't even see the slides.
Oh.
And I reloaded and it still doesn't work.
Well, I see you. I see everybody. I see you, Robin. I don't see Eric.
I see everyone.
I don't see Eric either.
Yeah, I see
everyone except Shizhen.
Yeah. If you click on the slide, I see the slides. So.
That's me.
Yeah, no, I don't see the slides.
I can see here, but my webcam died.
Oh. Now the slides came back. Okay, good. Sorry, it's hard to talk about slides that you can't actually see. So. Okay, so we're on data channel. We agreed to remove the promise, so now it is exactly like 1.0 otherwise, and hopefully they will clean up some of the issues that are there in 1.0.
Yep.
Okay, so DTMF sender is exactly like 1.0, except you use the constructor, you construct it off of the RTP sender instead of the way that they were doing, which was through a create method, through a factory method. So that's the only difference. So I don't think that's controversial.
That's good.
Next, ORTC specific proposals. We've got a bunch of stuff to go through. Hopefully the few first are not controversial, and then the rest might be a little bit more so. So let's get through it.
Before we get into this, I just want to talk a little bit about alignment between WebRTC and ORTC. I just want us to be really careful about our messaging. I thought we talked a little bit the last time about what the messaging should be, that sort of ORTC is going to graduate, and then WebRTC 1.1 will be the unified thing of existing WebRTC plus the work coming out of ORTC. And I want to make sure we sort of stick to that messaging and not ORTC as a replacement for WebRTC. We have Firefox kind of on board, basically contingent on that messaging, and if they sort of get the feeling that ORTC is going to be throwing away the work done for WebRTC, they're going to be much more concerned, and I've already gotten some sort of feedback from them based on some other things that have happened, based on some stuff that they saw at the WebRTC Expo in Atlanta. So I just want to make sure that as a working group or a community group that we're all agreed on this, and if we're not agreed, we should discuss now, and then we're just very careful about this messaging as we go forward.
Yeah, I think we are clear about it, but we should be clear about the implications. I think the implications are twofold. One of which is that all of the 1.0 objects that get put in need to be exactly consistent with the ORTC stuff, so we have to sync that. The other is the whole shim requirements, and I think we've all agreed that it needs to be shimmable, but I think we need to get it down to really an actual practical demonstration that would need to be done so we actually know that that's fulfilled. Right now it's a little bit unclear.
I mean, the shimming stuff, I feel like we need to move in that direction, make sure it's shimmable. But I think that we're doing the right things there, and I think that we may find out that some things are not shimmable, and what we end up doing is just kind of saying that stuff is not. You don't get that stuff if you use WebRTC 1.1, and that eventually that stuff will be deprecated from 1.0, and this may be things like RTCP non-mux or some other things. And we have support for that. I'm just saying the need to shim universally may not be a hard requirement.
Yeah, so I mean, I did get a question at the conference, which is a good question, which is, what is the backward compatibility commitment? Because I said there was one, that this wasn't gonna, like you said, it's not a competitor or anything, it has to be consistent. And people said, well, what exactly is the commitment? How do you prove that you meet it? Well, other than, if the objects are all the same, that's certainly a good thing. But, there were some very specific questions about how do you guarantee that? How do you...
I need to jump to another room. I'll be back in a minute.
I think we lost you, Bernard, maybe. Yes, you're right. It's a little bit difficult to say how do we prove it, so to speak. I think what it comes down to is that whatever comes out of the WebRTC specification, we should be compliant with as much as possible, unless it's just not possible for whatever reason. And so if it is in the specification of 1.0 for WebRTC, it's a little or unclear. It either needs to be clarified so we can be consistent, or it'll be impossible for us to say that we're compliant otherwise. Bernard, are you there? Or is anybody there, by the way?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, just making sure I'm not talking to myself.
I think everybody can hear you, Robin. I think we lost Bernard.
Microphone is gone, probably.
Okay. I don't know if Justin wants to. I agree that we need to have that messaging, and I agree with what Justin said. I'm not quite sure what the alternative messaging was coming across. Bernard, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Yeah, I've tried to be really clear. I was at the WebRTC conference that this isn't, a big change. There are shift criteria relating to backward compatibility that have to be proven. But there was certainly a lot of nervousness about it, and so it would be good, at least if we were sure what the shift criteria is, and in particular if we had a way of making sure it was demonstrated so that we didn't get any nasty surprises.
Yeah. And certainly we're not looking to replace the WebRTC 1.0, nor are we looking to disrupt it. The idea, hopefully, is that they'll converge at some point between the two, and we'll have something great as a result. But
there certainly are a lot of questions about it and what the nature of the guarantee is. and people want to see something very concrete, not just a lot of hot air. So.
Yeah.
So what was this expo you went to, and
I was
how did
at
it
the
come up?
I was at the WebRTC Expo, and at the WebRTC Expo, and the question people had was, can I run my 1.0 apps on this top of this ORTC thing, and how will I know that it'll run? Is somebody going to have an open source project? What if it's? How do you know you're finished with that, or that the API actually gives you? Because I talked about the kind of guarantees you'd have. One is that we won't change the object and method definitions between 1.0 and 1.1. So that's one set of stuff that can do everything that you can do in 1.0 in 1.1. So that's yet another set of things. And 3 is that you can produce the shim. Those were the criteria that I outlined for ORTC. But people wanted a little bit. They wanted to actually see, well, are you going to demonstrate there's a library that does this? It's a subject of a lot of concern. Let's put it that way.
Okay, so I think we need to make sure that we come out. So just a generalized action item, then it sounds like we need to have a clear statement as to what exactly our future plans are, so to speak, and stuff like that. But I don't know if we can come up with the messaging in this meeting, nor do I think we necessarily should. But Justin, you're back, so you might want to make more comment.
Yeah, I'll just make the general comment that people are very concerned about the backward compatibility guarantees, like to the point of asking specifically what the ship criteria are, and they want more than just general statements. The general statements I made were, 1, we won't change the methods, and objects will be consistent between 1.0 and 1.1, so there won't be any gratuitous changes. Number 2, that you will be able to produce a shim, and actually write that JavaScript library. And what did I say the third one was? Oh yeah, but everything you can do in 1.0 can be done in 1.1. But people wanted to see something more concrete, like is there an open source project which will demonstrate that these criteria are fulfilled? They didn't want just words. They wanted to actually have some feeling that their code would actually work, and that somebody had actually put thought into doing that before giving them an API.
Yeah, I had some communication with some of those in the press to remain unnamed, who were looking for a debate on ORTC versus WebRTC, and I went out of my way to try and educate this individual. I don't think I'm not sure if the message got through or not, but I think that the points that Bernard are bringing up are kind of the reasoning behind the concern.
The point I would make is that these folks, they want more than just words. They have real code they're writing. They want to make sure it doesn't get busted, and they want to make sure there's a real commitment and a set of projects that actually get them to some demonstrated level. So I don't know that we need to go into it infinitely, but I think at least our understanding in our minds of the SHIP criteria, and in particular the specific projects that demonstrate that those SHIP criteria have been met. It's kind of what people are expecting.
Can we give Justin the last word here so we can move on, because we've got a lot of stuff to do?
Yeah, so I assume you're talking about the CNET guy who was looking for the press quotes. I actually know him pretty well, and he contacted us too, which is one of the reasons I'm bringing this up. But the bottom line is just that I think that if we say that WebRTC, this is going, the expected sort of final thing here is this is a WebRTC 1.1 that preserves the 1.0 API. Then we can even sidestep some of the shimming stuff as well. How someone chooses to implement that in their own browser, whether it's a JS layer on top of 1.1, that's an implementation decision. But like what we're telling the applications is that you're going to get your existing 1.0 API, as is, and then you'll have this great 1.1 stuff if you want to go down and really control the low-level bits. And I think that's just a really consistent story that the 1.0 stuff is not going to disappear.
Right.
Anyway.
Absolutely agree.
Okay, let's continue on then.
Okay.
Yeah, we might want to actually put just any statements that we can make to clarify this. I think would be useful. It is a subject of anxiety, so I'll just put that out there.
Okay. We got to move on. I'm sorry, guys. Ice, next slide, please. Does it work? Okay, ICE restart. So we had an issue outstanding that we missed the whole restart thing, and so I wasn't quite sure exactly what the needs are. So, and I don't know if Bernard, you know either, but so we just added a method called restart, and what it does is it brings us back to the gathering state and flushes all remote candidates. So I wanted a verification from you, Justin, that this is what you meant when you said we missed it, to make sure that we're complete now.
Yeah, that's pretty close. The real question is, how do we get the new ICE username and password? And I think we just need to kind of write out the code example for this.
Wouldn't that be in the .get local parameters, where it is right now?
Well, the question is it, can you restart by pushing down, your own username and password, or do you restart and then get username and password? I think that's the key thing. Or how does a remote restart? How does that end up working out? So, the short answer is that this does sort of what I expect it to do. I think we need to just write an example of what happens if we restart, a single ICE thing, either on local or remote, and what happens if we restart multiple ICE transports, either on locally or remote.
So this does affect the ICE listener then, because the ICE listener holds the local username and fragment and password.
Yeah, it would. It would basically, if you were to restart, and that maybe that even means it needs to be on the ICE listener, because it's going to invalidate, or not immediately invalidate, but it's going to start regathering a new set of candidates, for that ICE listener.
Well, if you restarted an ICE transport, wouldn't that sort of detach itself from the listener?
Well, I don't think so, because the ICE listener is the thing that actually does candidate gathering, and then those things get vended then to the ICE transport. So if it detaches the ICE listener, then it's going to implicitly create another one somewhere.
Right. That's what I'm saying. If you do an ICE restart, can't that implicitly create a new ICE listener? And the whole point of ICE listeners to do media forking. If you're doing an ICE restart, presumably media forking is out of the picture now, right?
Well, not necessarily. You might be restarting because you were trying to reestablish a call with a new third party. I'm just very circumspect of APIs where it says, well, we're definitely not going to do X here, so we can do it some other simple way. If we already have the ICE listener mechanism, I would think that we probably push the button on the ICE listener.
You call restart on the ICE listener.
Or the other option is to create a brand new ICE listener and associate your ICE transport to that new ICE listener. Is that a possibility as well?
Well, yeah. The main thing is we still need to preserve the unfreezing rules, which is the reason why I thought that adding a new ICE transport wouldn't work in this case, because we don't have any way to figure out what is the right ordering of the unfreezing for the new ICE transports you slam in there. I think we probably can't discuss this properly in plenary form. I think we need to just work through the example and figure out what's needed here. There needs to be a method. It might need to take credentials, it might not, and it might need to be on the transport, it might need to be on the listener. And if we go through the exercise, we'll figure it out.
Okay, fair enough. So let's keep the issue open or reopen it if it was closed, or open a new one and make sure that we do exactly that work. And it sounds like there is a problem because it probably doesn't belong on the transport. It probably belongs on the listener. Okay.
There's also a relevant question here, whether we allow restart with a different gather policy or not. Justin, can you comment on that?
Yeah, we definitely need to support that. I think, in fact, that if you change the gather policy or the ICE transports, you have to restart in certain cases. That once you've gathered all your candidates and you've done the done thing, the only way you can then gather candidates for a different policy is by restarting.
Okay, right. So right now the restart method doesn't take any parameter right now. So we need to think through.
I know that Martin was pretty adamant that you should just create a new ICE listener, but I'm not sure I'm up to speed on the compatibility issues, so to speak on that on his behalf. So
the main reason not to do that is because of freezing?
Yeah, the main reason that we can't slam in a new transport is because we have no way to do the freeze ordering on the new set of transports.
Why can't you just add the new transport to the controller object?
Barf. Like now we have like, you know, it's not clear like what the relationship is between the old transports and the new transports and their relative ordering. And then do we want to have two transport controllers? I think it gets really messy, and I think that it's sort of that's a code smell that indicates that we're going down the wrong path.
Okay, well, why don't we argue this one on the list and keep the issue open and work through it and see what proposals we've got on this. So it sounds like we're not done on this part. Okay, next. CNAME. So this came from Emil originally asked about the whole CNAME issue in our RTCP, and that we didn't have one. And you have no way to retrieve the value, nor do you have a way to set. And the ability to retrieve the value is more important than the ability to set. So I proposed on the list that we just add to the RTCP parameters that we have the CNAME string, which will get defaulted using our defaulting mechanism, which we're going to discuss later. And it would be defaulted to a JavaScript CNAME for the sandbox. And that's it. And if you want to set it, you can always override it.
Yeah, so I have a question about this. Is it our expectation that setting this stuff is somehow the way to do control lip sync?
CNAME is traditionally used for that, I believe. I don't know if it's still used for that purpose.
Yeah, my question is like people slamming values into the CNAME and expecting this to affect sync in various ways seems a little weird to me.
I don't know.
I understand getting it. That makes sense to me. But I mean, because at 1.0 you can't set the scene, right?
Well, so we did talk about this a little bit in the working group. That if you wanted to have, I forget exactly what the scenario was here, but if you wanted to have a single thing that went to multiple, maybe audio and video having different synchronization contexts, then you would have, you can set the CNAME here. For right now, I would just make this readable, I think, that we generate a CNAME internally, and then once we understand the scenario a little better, we can allow this to be fully specified.
Yeah, that's kind of what I would want to do. It's just that because it's in the dictionary, right, people can start writing to it.
Yeah, the demand was definitely for reading, not necessarily writing. So if there is controversy over writing regarding its behavior, then we should make it a readable only, and settable has no meaning.
Well, the part that gets weird, though, is that by default, like all senders should have the same CNAME.
Yes.
So I don't know how we're going to accomplish that exactly, because unless we're going to chain them together using the controller, it won't be clear which senders are, on the same for the same connection thing, if you will.
Well, it's even weirder than that because you can always reassign a sender to a new ICE transport, and you wouldn't necessarily want your CNAME to change as a result of that. So in fact, you need to have a consistent CNAME at all times, which means that to me it makes sense that every sandbox for JavaScript gets its own CNAME generated.
Yeah, that's where we're going to run into trouble because we've already said for 1.0 that the CNAME is per peer connection, not per origin or sandbox or whatever. So if you want to have calls going to two different parties, A and B, you might want to have separate CNAMEs there to prevent linkability.
So I think the point is it's something the system gives you, right? And you can. And the question is, do you need more control? Like for the shim, for example, would that imply some level of control you'd need to have?
Well, for the shim, it would imply that you need to be able to basically, if you could set the CNAME, then it'd be fine. Because the shim could basically, for peer connection A, generate CNAME A, and for peer connection B, generate CNAME B, and then pass it down, you're done. So I mean, that would be an argument for saying, well, we need to have the setting, and the default behavior here is that you get a CNAME that's per origin, per sandbox or whatever. I think it would be nice if we could preserve the same thing that any senders that were hooked to the same they're basically on the same controller would have the same CNAME. I mean,
I have a question about this. Can anyone hear me?
Yep.
I'm all by myself. Okay, so on the RTP sender, the purpose of the parameters is to tell the browser basically what packets to send. On the RTP receiver, the purpose is to tell the browser interpret the packets. So how does setting the CNAME and the parameters affect the actual packets going on the wire? Like, where does CNAME actually affect that?
It causes SDES. There's RTCP SDES that gets generated, and that includes a CNAME.
Yeah, but it shouldn't have any effect on the receiver, right? You can't like write the CNAME on the receiver. That makes no sense.
Yeah, the receiver is read-only, effectively read-only, because it'll tell you what it is as opposed to when it discovers it.
But the RTP receiver.
Okay, so this value actually goes inside it.
This value goes in the sender. You broke up, so I couldn't hear your statement.
Well, it gets.
Yeah, sorry.
I mean, the RTC parameters are both in the sender and receiver, except we're just saying in the receiver setting it makes no sense.
So that's the part I don't understand, though, because
that's true for.
Both RTP sender and receiver will generate RTCP, and that will include CNAME and the RTCP that's generated.
Well, the reason is because the CNAME is dictated by the sender, and the receiver is just passively receiving it. So therefore, you can't. If you set it, what does it mean on the receiver? So.
Yeah. Okay. I think I misunderstood. Carry on.
Okay, so there is a strong argument.
Affect the packets, but
okay, so
in the RTP packets, so that makes sense to me.
Yeah, so on the sender, there is a strong use case.
Sense to say.
Sorry, Peter, I didn't.
Sorry. No, my network's doing so well. Just apologize.
There is a strong.
I'm okay with saying it. Okay, I'll just mute myself and.
Sorry, I didn't mean it. Anyway, apologies for that. There seems to be a strong reason to set the CNAME, to be able to set the CNAME, especially for the sake of the shim, because of the privacy issue and the peer connection backwards compatibility. Sounds like we need it. The only question is how does it affect the lip syncing issue? So it sounds like we need to do a little bit more discovery work in there to define the meaning. Does it have meaning or not regarding that? And if it does, what exactly it means. But otherwise, in principle, it sounds correct. That is my interpretation here.
So this is an open issue in WebRTC 1.0. How does lip synchronization actually get communicated? I think we should wait for them to figure that out before we try to do anything more than what's already here.
Agreed. Peter, do you want to add anything before we go? Next. Guess not, or you didn't unmute. Okay. So parameter defaulting. So the issue is that on the sender, many of the dictionary entries are completely optional, but as a where the engine, the browser engine, is going to fill in those default for you, and you want to know what the browser engine has chosen, and that's for the sender side. And on the receiver side, you want to know when the latching rules take effect, what actual SSRCs or other optional options get automatically filled in. So on the sender side, there's the issue is that are all of the optional options immediately available the moment you call the send, or will some things require some asynchronous processing due to UI thread blockage or other reasons where you'd want to return it as a promise saying, hey, when are all the send options ready to go? And on the receiver side, it sounds like these defaulted options can get filled in over time, where, for example, the RTCP name is only discovered when the SDES arrives, and some of the other FEC information only may arrive when some other packets arrive. So it sounds like on the receiver side that we might have issue that it's not just filled in once, but continuously filled in. So you can go to the next slide. I'm just making general statements. So the very first question is, how do you get these parameters once they're defaulted by the engine in the first place? So it seems like we need a get parameters method to return the current set of parameters that are active right now. And I don't think that one is controversial as the eventing mechanism that we're going to need. So unless there's comment on this, I'd like to move on to the eventing issue. So next slide.
Wait, well, I did have one comment. Peter, go ahead. You go ahead first.
So I don't understand why the sender would ever have a state where it's not clear what the parameters actually are. That the sender thing should really be do what I said to do, not do what I mean. And if you didn't pass in enough stuff, it doesn't work.
Well, the issue has to do with some of the optional stuff, like the SSRC. In the sender, you don't actually have to pick the SSRC in advance. You can just default it, or you're saying that you have to set every single setting and no optionals.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is, like, say you wanted to set up a simulcast or a layered coding, the system's going to pick the SSRCs, so you just leave them out. And then the question is, but you want to signal them to the other side, so you got to get them, right, and then package them up and signal them. That's just one example.
I mean, I think it would be better. I mean, I personally think it would be better if you had to specify that stuff in the sender. You know, because you might need to signal this, and if you have to signal this and wait for the sender to figure out what it's actually doing, it's not clear that you can the timing and stuff like that will all be right. I think it would be a lot easier if this API was, do what I told you to do, and if you didn't specify the stuff that needs to be specified in order for the lower layers to do its thing, like there's no generation, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, so the question, it really has, I think the biggest issue is the SSRC allocation.
I think SSRC allocation is not that hard.
Shouldn't be.
In the sender,
right? Just got to count stuff and come up with the SSRCs.
I don't think that all the complexity I've seen around this is worth just SSRC allocation.
Yeah, that's my sort of point. That JavaScript just picks some random numbers and off you go.
Do they have to be cryptographically random?
No.
They could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 as far as I care. I mean, like,
right.
If you know what you're doing, you can do whatever.
Yeah.
I'm just asking if there was an issue regarding that security-wise.
I mean, on the sender, I don't see any reason why this should take any significant amount of time.
No, and I agree. Even if you did have the system defaulted for you, to me it should be immediately available. But I'm okay with the concept as the sender. Hey, you have to fill in everything, and if you don't, well, too bad for you.
Well, but hold on. Remember, when you call send, the application just can't. It's allocated by the browser, not by the application, right?
Why can't it be allocated by the application?
Because then you could have conflicts. I mean, you really don't want to have the application in charge of allocating SSRCs and dealing with conflicts.
I don't understand why that is.
Well, I mean, like an example is if today, if you have a conflict, the browser will take care of it.
What do you mean by conflict? I don't understand.
Well, if you pick the number 5 SSRC and some other stream is sending with 5 as well, the remote party can generate a conflict, and therefore you have to change your SSRC to some other number on one of your streams. So the browser is supposed to take care of that for you. But that doesn't mean you can't allocate it.
This is another thing I don't understand. Like, if I'm writing the JavaScript and I have an application, and I'm sending with SSRC5, and then the other side decides to send me with SSRC5, like, why do I even have to care?
No, that's a non-issue. The issue is that if there's an ambiguity between two receivers and you're using the same SSRC, you have to conflict one or both. It's part of the RTP rules. So there's already a conflict resolution mechanism, and it's really terrible, but it exists, and you can't avoid it. So but that doesn't prevent you from allocating the original set of SSRCs and allowing the conflict resolution engine to take care of it for you. The only issue is how would you discover what those new values end up being later when the engine detects a conflict.
So what you're saying is that I'm the JavaScript. I choose the SSRC 5. I tell you send these packets with SSRC 5, and then at some point the browser says, oh, I can't send with 5?
Right, you actually start sending with 5 to the remote party, and then the remote party says, no, 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 there's a conflict, you have to choose another one.
But wait, how does the remote party tell you there's a conflict?
The buy mechanism. So
I think that we're not going to resolve this issue in the remaining like 5 minutes or less in this call.
No.
Do you want to sort of then just discuss how I want to wrap this up? And we didn't even cover the simulcast or the SVC stuff. What we want to do next?
Okay, well let's take this parameter defaulting to the list again. It's a really simple, it's like exactly what the API is, and once we figure it out, we'll have the answer. I don't think it's blogging anything. So this is to do with the MST and SST, and we'll try and get through this very quickly. We're not supporting MST where you have an RTP sender and it splits your into the packets into various layers, and then you send the layer on one over one ICE transport for one layer, and then a different ICE transport for another layer. We're not going to support MST. SST is where it splits it off into layering, and it sends it over the same ICE transport, and we have to support that because that's mandatory. But then there's SST. If you go to the next slide, again, we're not supporting MST. The next slide. There is the possibility of SST SS versus SST MS, and the difference is that each layer gets its own SSRC versus all the layers have the same SSRCs. Some codecs do support the concept of multi-stream, and there is a reason to do so with an SFU where you want to avoid some kind of a decryption going on and rewriting the packet headers. It allows you to easily drop additional layers by way of the SSRC. So that's the use case here.
That use case doesn't work, though. I mean, we've kind of been through this in that the SFU really can't do that. There's a bunch of stuff that gets messed up.
It doesn't have to rewrite the sequence numbers, but it still has to decrypt and re-encrypt.
Yeah.
Okay. So then the question is, do we want to support SST MS at all then?
Yeah, we actually implement this for H.264 SVC. But having said that, the Open H.264, I believe, is SST SS. And certainly VP8 is SST SS.
It would certainly simplify things if we did not support MS. If there's no strong demand for it, we should not support it, in my opinion.
Well, let me just give you one case and ask how this would work. So one thing we've considered is having a different codec type for MS versus SS. In that case, it could be then the codec name could inherently tell you whether it's MS or SS. Right, so if you said had H.264 SVC, it could implicitly be SS, right? And then another one could be H.264 SVC MS. That would be a different codec name. And then you wouldn't, which would only do it, would implicitly only support MS. So that way you wouldn't need the capability and the setting. If that would work, then I think we wouldn't say we didn't support either one, but we would say a given codec is only one.
Yeah,
so
that's
I think it's important.
Separate issue, though. Like
I think it's important to realize.
Go ahead, Peter.
I think it's important to realize that with our current encoding parameters, you are already capable of choosing between SS and MS. It's just a question of whether the codec in the browser, like the implementation, can support both or not. And so whether we have in our capabilities the ability for the browser to express whether it does one or the other or both. It's really the question.
Correct.
Yeah, see,
So Bernard,
one thing to
Bernard's
keep in
saying
mind,
it's
yeah.
picking the codec name.
In some sense, it has to do with the discussion we just had, because as an example in VP8, as I understand it, when you ask for these SSRCs to be allocated, you'll always get the same one, because there's no concept of VP8 MS. Right? So there's no capability I need to know about VP8 and no setting I need to know about VP8, because I'll know what it always will be. I think the only ambiguity you get into is if a given codec can support either mode. And it's, in my opinion, it's very painful when you do that.
Okay, that might.
But Bernard, you're saying that, I mean, would it be possible to just say that that all codecs need to support both?
No, because then you'd basically be telling someone who did VP8 you have to create another version of VP8 that supports MS, and that makes no sense. There's no reason.
Well, why do you keep bringing up VP8? I don't understand, because VP8
brought
doesn't have scalability at all anyway.
No,
right?
it does. It supports temporal scaling with the same SSRC for all the temporal layers.
Oh, you're talking about temporal. Oh.
Yeah, I'm just saying that a lot of that VP8 and VP9 are only SSTSS, and for that reason, there's nothing. You don't have to tell me what your VP8 capability is, and you don't have to have a setting for it. And I'm saying that most implementations of H.264 SVC, though not all, are also SSTSS. So one way to simplify this might be just to use the codec name. Like if you wanted to do an H.264, I'm saying that it's a relatively rare thing where it just happens to be us who do an H.264 SVC version that supports MS, and only MS, I should add. So we could have a different codec name for that particular thing, and then you wouldn't need the capability or the setting because it would be implicit in the codec. I'm just saying that could be one way to simplify this mess.
Okay, well, there's the question. The first question is, do we need to support MS at all? And if the answer is yes, then it's a minor nit as to how we're expressing the capability. And I don't think we need to argue that point. I think we just need to say yes, we are definitively supporting MS or not. We can do it in the encoding parameters. The question is, do we want to from an engine perspective?
Yeah, I just have to think. You just have to be careful what you mean by support. I think there's two separate questions. One is if you have a capability. The other is if you have a setting for it. And you could decide not to have a capability in a setting because it just creates potential pain. Because you could set it for something that doesn't support it, and it just creates errors you don't need. And the second thing is whether the RTC, RtP encoding parameters could have a different SSRC for SVC layers. That's what I mean by supporting MS.
Support. Now, I'll tell you what I mean by support. A browser engine never has to include any codec that has MS. That's not the issue. But as a JavaScript developer, do you need to worry about looking at a codec and realizing, hey, this is an MS-only codec, and therefore I need to code it in a certain way? And that's what I mean by support, is it a possibility that an MS codec will exist with ORTC or not?
What I'd hope we could get to would be that either codec could be configured in either way, depending on what you want to do as an application. And that maybe we don't support, in the original phases, we don't support MS, but it's there in the API. So if we need to support that in the future, we don't need to go rejigger the whole API. Now, the only question I have is around, like, we say MS only is for spatial, or we also support MS for temporal. And I think that's the biggest open question, because we probably could have some simplifications if we didn't need to support MS for temporal.
Okay, then I suggest, because we're out of time pretty much, that we table the how to express it and capabilities onto the list, and just to remember that MS is not needed to be supported by any engine that doesn't choose to support it. And if we're okay with that, let's skip the rest because we're out of time. And then I'm just going to do a wrap up, if that's okay. Aside from these minor nits that we discussed today, we've got a bunch of little tiny issues to clean up. We're looking for people to start implementing this API, and defining here is to what we mean by last call. It doesn't mean that the API is finished by any means. In order to really truly finish the API, we need people to implement it on it so that we know what issues we have. So it'd be really great if people could start volunteering and start organizing around different projects that we have to start implementing so we can flush out the remaining issues in the ORTC API. If we can go to the next slide, Eric. So I think we've covered this, so let's go, yeah, this slide. So we've got a whole bunch of projects, open source community projects set up right now, which some are already under development and some are not. So we're calling people to start, you know, if they'd like to work on that, let's start working on these various projects. There could be others that people want to do, but we've got these defined already. A C++ implementation, we need to have the shims, we need to create the create params, filter params equivalency, we would like to do a Node.js implementation, and obviously we'd love to have the browser implementers start implementing ORTC, whoever's willing to at this time. I think that's for each vendor to decide. And if you'd like to volunteer, this is how. First, join the community group. We have on ortc.org/dev, we have a mailing list, link to the mailing list, and you can go there and sign up, start saying what you would like to do, and participating in the open source projects. It's a little loosey-goosey right now because we don't have an exact formal process, nor do I think we need one right at this moment. Otherwise, that's it. That's all I wanted to say, and anybody else who wants to have the floor, last say, go ahead. Peter, Justin, Bernard, anything?
Just that I think we've discovered some more work we need to do in the last hour and a half.
Yeah, we do. When we expected that, but that doesn't mean people can't start implementing stuff, because I think we got enough meat and potatoes here to start working with it.
Yeah, so let's just capture the stuff we didn't get to today, like in the issue tracker. And then maybe we can have a quick sync up to kind of go over the state of the issue tracker and just go through some of those things. We've been switching, again, in the one work group, we've been switching to just kind of going through the issue tracker to analyze some of the things that need to be done. And we probably could, maybe have more frequent sync ups, less kind of preparation, just kind of go through the issue tracker. That's what we need to do to close out some of these final issues.
And also look at the issue list. It'd be very helpful to mark each one, whether it's a 1.1 or 1.2, so we can set the right expectation.
Yeah, I think that's a valid comment, Shizhen.
You can set milestones in GitHub, and we should apply the appropriate milestone.
Yep.
And labels as well.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Anybody else wants to speak up now, or will not forever hold your peace? We'll have another chance soon.
Yep.
I'm kind of wondering, in terms of sync up, if anybody has any kind of time frame in mind. I know that I/O is happening imminently, and I'm not sure what's happening next week, but summer is upon us. So do we want to try and get this done before everybody splits, or what's the feedback there?
I think more frequent sync might be useful to nail down some of these things we just talked about.
Yeah, so summer's already upon me. Basically, after I/O, I'm going to turn into a pumpkin for like 2 or 3 weeks. But I do think that, and there's IETF at the end of July. So I think that for many of us, or at least for me, my time's going to be pretty much booked until like the end of July. I don't know if anyone's planning on coming to IETF. It's kind of in your neck of the woods. It's in Toronto. But I'd be sort of up for trying to close out some of this stuff before the end of the summer.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Bernard, are you going to? I expect that you'll be at the next IETF meeting.
I'll be in Toronto. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's pretty close to Robin's territories, so maybe we can arrange to have. I'm not sure, Robin, what your schedule is looking like for the end of July.
I don't take vacation, so. Anyway, we'll create a doodle or something like that to try and figure this out. Vacation time is always difficult, but okay.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
See you online.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.